So we have a really sad story. This month, a 13-year-old Connecticut student reportedly overdosed on fentanyl while at school. So his death has renewed pleas for schools to get stocked with the opioid antidote, Naxalone, as well as training for staff and students on how to respond to overdoses. The Hartford, Connecticut mayor said that because of the student's young age, an opioid death did not immediately come to mind when the school nurse and first responders treated him.
Well, fentanyl has been showing up in marijuana, in pills, and in other substances that are accessible to adolescents. According to the CDC, the 15 to 24 age group saw the largest percent increase in drug overdose death rates from 2019 to 2020. For the first time last year, more than 100,000 Americans died from fentanyl-related overdoses. Editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, join us to discuss. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, guys.
So Max, I understand, they said, well, we don't have this yet. This didn't really occur to us. Maybe that's not the lamest excuse ever. It seems like this is something schools are going to have to deal with in the future, and they should probably move in the direction of having this in stock, I guess. What would you advise them?
Well, I would just say, as a human being and a concerned citizen more than, an expert on any of this, right, that I agree. I think that the thing that I really hope, right, is that as a country, as a culture, as a people, we don't replay the same mistakes that we've made in the past where our puritanical impulses sort of kick in and we don't want to acknowledge that this is a problem. And so we actively suppress, mitigating measures that could save lives, right? We may not want to accept that fentanyl is finding its way into schools, and it's found its way all across the country, right? This is not just an issue that is impacting youth, but as you said, there was a very shocking rise in overdose deaths in young people. But this is, very much kind of a very serious problem, and fentanyl is incredibly strong and lethal. And frankly, everyone should have a bottle of Narcan in their pockets or in their cars or in their purses, frankly, because it is that level of preparedness that we need, and you genuinely can save people's lives with it. I have a bottle downstairs, right? It's I guess that maybe not to sound too Pollyannish about this, because I know I'm not really talking about like the problem itself, but just because we don't want to acknowledge that this is happening doesn't mean that we shouldn't, take precautions to try to save a person's life if we can. And having a bottle of Narcan, knowing how to use it, can really save people's lives. It does every day. And I think we do need to have more people with it, more schools with it, and more people prepared to use it if they need to, God willing, or God forbid.
Max, you bring up a really important point, which is we don't want to talk about this. Emily, why doesn't anybody want to talk about this? There's a national emergency, 100,000 opioid deaths last year, and you just never hear this at the top of anybody's list of priorities. You just don't hear about this. Why is that, Emily?
Well, I think we'll start hearing about it more in coming days, because what's happening is that, and this example is sadly really representative of that trend, and Robbie mentioned it in the intro, the fentanyl is finding its way into all kinds of different drugs, and not just sort of hitting particular areas, but we've seen, for instance, people in Los Angeles who thought they were just using cocaine overdose on fentanyl because that's what's finding its way into their drugs. And so I think as this sort of creeps into different corridors, because the fentanyl it'll become sadly a top line issue. It should, to your point, Bacha, which is so true. It should have always been, and on the sort of front and center of our national discourse. It's ravaging communities and has been for a long time. But I think, as it starts to make its way into different demographics, as it's packed into different drugs, our elites don't want to talk about this. It's not a convenient subject for them. A lot of this comes from China, then comes through Mexico, and there's all kinds of different business and political interests tied up in the reasons that fentanyl is finding its way into these substances. But I sadly think we will talk more and more about it as it affects more and more people across different demographics.
Well, and Emily, the rights, as of 20 years ago, I think the approach the right took with drugs. No, don't take no drug. Any amount of drugs you take, you'll die immediately. It was wrong. It was not persuasive because then people tried marijuana. They're like, what are you saying? This is fine. But now, like, if you take a drug that is a drug that would not be particularly harmful under other circumstances, or a dose that would not be harmful under circumstances, people die the first time they try drugs if it happens to have fentanyl in it. Like, that message is you are now taking that risk. I
like that you've become sort of a mom from the 90s, Robbie. No. One and done. But no, sadly, you're right. Yeah. Tragically, that's actually true right now.
Yeah. Well, in California, Governor Newsom proposed a plan to spend $50 million on youth opioid education as overdoses have accelerated during the pandemic. According to data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, opioid overdose deaths more than tripled among Californians aged 34 and under since 1999. 20 states have laws allowing schools to possess and administer naloxone, and 7 other states required schools to have naloxone use policies as of August 2020. I'm having trouble saying this word. This is how familiar I am with the product. Clearly, I need to educate myself. Yeah, I remember talking a couple years ago with people about how law enforcement needed to start carrying, or first responders, obviously, but people called to law enforcement situations. So in some ways, it's depressing that it's progressed from that to now we need it in the schools. Now you need it maybe on you at all times or in your car, as you were saying, Max. So we're just kind of talking about how to deal with the problem, not how to even solve the roots of the problem. It probably just can't be solved.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other big discussion that needs to include a lot of kind of sociological analysis, right? I mean, because it's something I've talked about on my show, Working People, in, economically depressed, deindustrialized areas where you see rises in opioid abuse, you see overdose deaths and stuff like that. The deaths of despair paradigm, right? There are a lot of kind of interconnecting factors that contribute to a certain type of a certain genre of drug abuse. And, again, it's a whole other discussion. But I think that, talking about the potential solutions does, open up some really necessary discussions, right? We were just talking about how other drugs are being laced with this. And that may, in fact, be an argument for drug legalization, because then they go through quality tests and quality checks, and they have certain regulations that you can be assured if you go to a dispensary to buy this or that drug, it's not going to be laced with fentanyl. But again, our puritanical impulses kick in and we say, no, that's going to encourage drug use. But it's like, well, people are dying by using those drugs anyway. So it's not a question. There is no real neutral position to take here, right? And so the question is, how do you save lives? How do you mitigate the damage? And there are other kind of ripple effects to this, right? I mean, like so many others who have worked, like manual labor jobs have, a really crappy back now. And, many working people actually need opioids to function in their daily lives.
Yes.
Not only because, they are they work under brutal conditions that break down their bodies, but because we have such a crappy, kind of healthcare system, and so many other forms of treatment are not readily available or accessible to people. But then what you see is, like I've experienced it, so many workers I've talked to have experienced it. They're like, the thing that I need and that I've been prescribed by a doctor, it's like I'm asking for heroin or something. And it's like, no, a doctor was the one who told me that I needed this. And now my insurance company is basically saying, we'll give you like 2 pills every 2 weeks. And you're kind of leaving people in a real bind here. So again, it has these sorts of ripple effects. And I think you're right, Robbie, that at the very least, we cannot pretend that this problem just isn't there or is going to go away. And we
denying people, medicine they need to manage their horrific pain would also be a grave moral failing. So I absolutely agree on that, and I think that is an important point to make when we talk about the opioid epidemic, because not giving people, and it's addictive and it is a tough issue, but also not giving people medicine they need to not be in constant pain is also really bad and happens. So great discussion. Thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.